Welcome everyone to another lecture, Microeconomics. And the slide behind me is rather empty, but yet we have a full program today. And it's also an important lecture because we deal with externalities today. So I will guide you through and let's get started. So externalities come in many forms, and one important example of an externality is the pollution that consumption and production decisions cause. So this is an example of the level of carbon monoxide across the globe. And as you can see, there are spots in many regions where the level of carbon monoxide is very high. And surprisingly, you see that high levels are also observed in the tropical rainforest of Brazil and in parts of India and Indonesia. And this is also because a lot of wood is burned over there, which is not a good thing to happen, but the picture shows that it does happen. And there's also a link that shows you a video on YouTube that gives you an impression how the nitrogen dioxide emissions reduced during the COVID pandemic in January till March 2020. And especially in northern Italy, that makes a big difference. So pollution is a major fact of life around the world. So we can think of environmental pollution, but as the picture shows, you can also think of pollution at a more regional scale, at the level of your student flat, and also that is an externality. So if your flatmate doesn't clean up his or her stuff, then it carries a negative externality to all other flatmates. So air quality, as mentioned, is a major issue, which has important health consequences and health costs estimated to be over 100 billion a year. And still, a lot of this pollution is due to coal-fired plants. And for that reason, it's also important to have markets to reflect the true cost of using that type of fuel. Other forms of pollution are, think of the noise of your neighbors when they have a party, which may be less festive for the other people in the block. Also, if you are in the public space and the person next to you is smoking a cigarette or a cigar, then depending on your taste, that may come with a positive externality if you like the smoke of cigars and cigarettes, but mostly you will experience that as pollution because you dislike it. If you are neighbors and you own your own house and you take care of your garden, then you may feel very sad if your neighbor doesn't keep up and makes a mess of his or her garden, also causing negative externalities. Negative externalities between neighbors, of course, are famous from the comic Donald Duck, where Donald Duck always has fights with his neighbor. Important pollution and negative externalities. In sum, all these outcomes are evidence of market failures. So far, general equilibrium, the world was nice. Under certain conditions, the market reached efficient outcomes. And now we enter the space where we have externalities that make the market not to reach efficient outcomes. So markets are efficient when all transactions that positively benefit society take place, and those that don't take place, then the market is efficient. And it does so by taking all costs and benefits into account. And that encompasses both the private benefits and private cost and the social cost and benefits. And in the second term, there occurs the problem, because in many instances, private cost and benefits are taken into account in transactions, but not the social cost and benefit. So, to give an example, if you have a smoker in the park, only concerned with his enjoyment of smoking the cigarette and not to the cost imposed on other people in the park. Other example is people with a dog, also in the park. They just let the dog shit in the park, sometimes at the place where the kids play soccer. That shitting of the dog is a cost to other users of the park, notably children playing soccer. And apparently the owners of the dogs don't take that into account. They engage in this type of behavior because they do take into account the private cost of taking care of the dog's manure by having this bag with them, such that they can dispense of the poo. That is a private cost. They do take it into account. That makes them decide not to do it. And the social cost to other users of the park, they don't take into account, which leads to this unfortunate outcome. As said, efficient markets take all these additional costs into account, but it often doesn't happen. And I already mentioned one source of market failure, which are the externalities. Other source of market failures is that the nature of the good under consideration has the properties of a public good. And that is something we will go into the second part of this lecture. But first, externalities. So, a definition of externalities is that these are the costs or benefits that affect a third party that is not directly involved into an economic transaction. So externalities come into two flavors. They may be negative externalities when there is a cost that is imposed on a third party that is not part of the transaction. So it's not a direct buyer or a seller, but despite that, the person experienced a negative cost. Example here is the air pollution from coal-fired power plants. But you can also have positive externalities where a third party not directly engaged into the transaction gets a benefit. So that is good in principle. So in spring, an obvious example are the beekeepers. So the bees, they produce honey. That is something that the beekeeper may take into account. Maybe those private benefits may be the reason for him or her to keep bees. But in the bees also help with pollinating crops. They are quite vital for that. And in that sense, they generate a positive benefit to all people who don't keep bees, but who own some apple trees and other crops. So when externalities are present, either positive or negative, then the cost and benefits to the society are different from the private cost and benefits to the people involved in the transaction. So there's a gap between the two. And if the people engaged in the transaction do not properly take that into account, then we reach the wrong market outcomes. So returning to the smoker, so I don't know whom of you is a smoker, but I'm not. But I can imagine that if you like smoking, then you weigh off the benefits and cost of smoking, and the private cost of smoking are, and this is a non-exhaustive list, but first of all, the cost of purchasing cigarettes, which is a quite expensive hobby to have. Another cost is the cost of having smelly clothing. The smell of cigarettes and the smoke gets into your clothing, and often it is not a very nice smell. You also develop yellow teeth, which are not considered attractive, so a cost as well. And last but not least, if you smoke for a longer time, then your private health cost may importantly increase, because smoking is proven to be a very unhealthy hobby to have. But that's not all. On top of that, there are additional costs to society. So a first cost is the second-hand smoke health effects. So if you are near to a smoker, then you also inhale some of the smoke, which is unhealthy, but also unpleasant. And there are also health costs that the smoker, him or herself, doesn't bear, but that are borne by society. So that part of the health cost is also a social cost. And then there's the smell imposed onto non-smokers. So again, not an exhaustive list. You can think of other side consequences of smoking, but these are just a few. So what then are the economic efficiencies from externalities? Well, in practice, these are the costs that we've listed before, and we call them the external marginal cost. So the marginal costs that are private, that the transacting parties take into account, they can call the intrinsic or the internal marginal cost. But now we talk of the external marginal cost, which are all the costs that are imposed on the third party when an additional unit or good of a good is produced or consumed. You can also have an external marginal benefit if there's a benefit conferred to a third party by the production or consumption of an additional unit. As long as there are no externalities, then the benefits to society and the cost perfectly align with the private costs and benefits. So then if you just leave it to the market, if you just leave it to the private parties, they will reach an outcome that is also optimal from a social point of view. But if there's this gap between the social cost and benefits and the private cost and benefits, that doesn't longer hold true. So the social cost of an economic transaction is the sum of the private cost and the external marginal cost. And the social benefit of an economic transaction is the sum of the private benefit plus the external marginal benefit. If you have negative externalities, then there's an external cost on society. So again, considering the coal-fired power plant. The power plant produces electricity, which is beneficial to society because we need electricity and ever more of it. But in the process of producing electricity, pollutants are released into the air. So different pollutants, and some of them are mentioned here, and they impose a social cost to society. And there's a nice paper published a couple of years ago that looks at the US and at subsidies for electric vehicles. Now, if you subsidize electric vehicles, one consequence is that more electric vehicles get sold. So then you also need more electricity to power those electric vehicles. And they look at the different states who derive the benefits from these subsidies and who bears the cost. And the outcome is that in California, people benefit because there more people start driving electric vehicles. That leads to cleaner air, which is a positive benefit for the people in California. However, California is not a region where electricity is produced. Most of the electricity is produced in states such as North Dakota. And in North Dakota, not many people drive an electric vehicle, but they do have a lot of these coal-fired power plants, so they bear a lot of the social cost of the increase in electric vehicles. So what the paper shows is that the benefits, the social benefits and cost of this drive towards electric powered cars are not evenly distributed across states and people. So the pollutants, they impact the environment and indirectly also human health, which creates welfare losses that we need to take into account. And the cost of operating the plant, so the direct cost of production, they are taken into account by the firm owners. So that's good. If the costs are too high, then they will not produce. But they do not incorporate into their decision-making process the social cost. And that means that if the social costs are high, that doesn't induce the firm owners to scale down on their production. So the production will be too high in equilibrium from a societal point of view. So now we had a lot of definitions and a number of examples, and now we go to the modeling side of all this and we consider a competitive market for electricity. So graphically, getting back to what we used to, we have a supply and demand curve, and since this is a competitive market, the supply curve is just the upward sloping part of the marginal cost curve of the firms. And if we leave it to the market, then the equilibrium quantity will be Q market and the equilibrium price will be P market. Novel thing here is that the production of electricity comes with an external marginal cost. So there's a cost of producing electricity that is not incorporated into the calculations of the plants, but is part of the cost that society needs to bear. And in this example, we have a constant external marginal cost. So it's a flat yellow bar that we have. And this means that the social marginal cost of producing additional units of electricity is not given by the marginal cost curve, the red curve over here, but is the sum of the marginal cost to the firm plus the external marginal cost to society. So the societal marginal cost is equal to the sum of the red curve and the flat yellow curve. So I've depicted it here. Since this one is constant, we just increase the red supply curve by the amount of the external marginal cost in order to reach the social marginal cost. And doing so, we observe that when we incorporate the cost to society, we reach a new equilibrium at the point A, and at this market equilibrium, the equilibrium quantity is lower and the equilibrium price is higher. So, and if you compare the points A and B, then you realize that if we do not incorporate the cost to society, but only the marginal cost to the firm, then we end up at point B, and in equilibrium, too much electricity will be sold and bought. And that leads to a deadweight loss. So the externality causes a deadweight loss because at point B, some people are buying electricity who would not have bought electricity if the price of electricity would have reflected the true cost to society. So at point B, the marginal consumer is buying electricity at the market price, but the market price, the price that he pays, is much lower than the social cost of producing this final unit of electricity. And the same holds for all the units between A and B, that the social cost is higher than the social benefits. And that creates the deadweight loss equal to the pink triangle over here. So this pink triangle represents the social cost associated with reaching the competitive outcome in case an externality is present. And how large this deadweight loss is very much depends on the size of the externality. So if the external marginal cost is high, then the externality will also be large. If the external marginal cost is small, negligible, then the deadweight loss will also be small. We considered negative externalities, but we can also consider the flip side when we have positive externalities. And positive externalities in principle are good. There are benefits to society that go beyond the private benefits of consumption. But again, also here it holds that if the market doesn't take these positive externalities into account, then the market will reach an equilibrium where the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price do not reflect the socially optimal quantities and prices. So we will go over an example. So the classic example of a positive externality is education. So you will be happy to hear this, but if you educate young people, that doesn't only carry benefits to the people that you train, because they know more than they did before, and it allows them to go for a better job and they earn a higher income. But in addition to that, there are also benefits to society. So the private benefits I don't discuss. They are part of chapter 16 in the book, but we don't treat chapter 16 in this course. But I want to focus on the social benefits. So if you have educated people in your society, then overall the entrepreneurial activity in that society is higher, which gives other people without an education also the chance of getting a job, because entrepreneurs, they create jobs. And you have more technological progress in a society, which is also a benefit to all people that did not take the education. So, and you could also mention that if people become or engage in education, if young people are in school or at universities, then they're not on the street, they're not idle, so the crime rate is also likely to go down because of education. So let's do this with a figure. So on the x-axis we have the quantity of college degrees, and then on the y-axis we have the price of a college degree. So if we look at the demand for college degrees, it's the blue downward sloping demand curve, and the supply of college degrees is given by the red line, reflecting again the marginal cost curve. But as said, college degrees not only carry a private benefit, but also an external marginal benefit. And again, we assume that the marginal benefit of an additional college degree, the external marginal benefit is constant. So again, we have a flat horizontal line. And this implies that the benefits to society exceed the private benefits that are reflected in the demand curve. So the social demand for college degrees is the private demand for college degrees plus the external marginal benefits. And the reason that you have to aggregate these two to get at the social demand is that if you consider the person over here, the demand curve reflects the person's willingness to pay for a college degree, which may be €1,000 a year. But if that person attaining a college degree also comes with a benefit to society, an external benefit of say €2,000, then the individual ideally should not be willing to pay 1,000 for his college degree, but 3,000, because only if the price is higher than 3,000, then the cost exceeds the benefits to society as a whole. Okay, so I already said what is now appearing in the boxes. And what you can see here is that from the social perspective, the equilibrium quantity of college degrees should be Q star. But if we leave it to the market, that doesn't take into account these private benefit or the social benefits, then we arrive at a lower number of educated people, a lower number of college degrees. And this, of course, is the reason, and we will get to that in section 17.2, that the government gives high subsidies to university education and also the lower levels of education. Because it realizes that education, the benefits of education, exceed the private benefits and also has great benefits to society. And also here we have a deadweight loss, because if we do not regulate this market, then we will arrive at equilibrium represented by point B. And some people between Q market and Q star, in the unregulated market, they decide not to take education because the private benefits are smaller than the private cost. Although from a societal point of view, the social benefits outweigh the social cost of education. So from a social point of view, they should take the education, and the size of the deadweight loss is equal to the pink triangle given over here. And that brings us to the first quiz of today. So now for something completely different. No education, but we are going to consider leather. And leather is sold in a perfectly competitive industry, and the short-run supply curve, the marginal cost curve in this industry, is an upward sloping 3Q curve. And Q is measured in millions of leather hides per year. And the inverse demand for leather hides is given by P is 60 minus 7Q, so clearly downward sloping. And the question to you then is, find the equilibrium price and quantity sold. Again, this is what we already knew before this lesson to do, just equating supply and demand in order to get a market price and a market quantity. But question B is new. Suppose that leather tanning is a polluting activity because a lot of water is needed and the water gets very filthy. That releases chromium and other pollutants into local waterways. The external marginal cost of that is estimated to be constant at $4 for each leather hide produced. Calculate the social optimal level of output and the price for the leather tanning industry. Good luck. And we continue with the answer to the first quiz. And the first question is easy. So we have to find a competitive outcome. And to do that, we set the inverse demand and supply equal to one another. So, and we solve for Q, and we arrive at an equilibrium quantity of 6 million hides. And we use the supply curve to solve for the equilibrium price. Of course, we can also use the inverse demand curve. But plugging in the 6 in the supply curve of 3 times Q, 3 times 6 is 18, so the equilibrium price is 18. More interesting is question B. So the social marginal cost is equal to the industry marginal cost and then plus the external marginal cost, which is constant, at 4 per leather hide. So the social marginal cost is equal to 3Q plus 4. To find the social optimum, we equate that with the inverse demand function, and we get that 3 times Q plus 4 should equal 60 minus 7Q. And solving for Q gives us the social optimum, and the social optimum is 5.6 million hides, which is lower than the 6 million hides that we found in question A. That's not a surprise, because this is an industry with a negative externality. So in the social optimally price is somewhat higher. So we plug in the 5.6 into the supply curve, and we get 3Q plus 4 is 20.8. And that solves quiz question 17.2. 1. And we will return to this at the end of this part of the lecture. So we observed that we can have externalities associated with a transaction, positive and negative externalities. They drive a wedge between the private cost and benefits and the social cost and benefits. So the equilibrium price and quantity in an unregulated market will not be automatically the social optimum. And that begs the question what we can do to solve this. So how can we fix for those externalities? And the government and regulators can do a couple of things to solve for these externalities, and some of them they work through their impact on prices. So think of imposing a tax or giving a subsidy, and others they work on the quantity that is produced and consumed. So you can also set a quotum, say. In all cases, what you first need to do, and that's not an easy task in practice, you need to determine the size of externality. So what is that we have to fix? And once we know that, we can also see by how much we have to adapt the production to reach the socially efficient outcome. Graphically, it looks as follows. So suppose now that we have the marginal cost of pollution, which is an upward sloping curve. So the first unit of pollution, that's not that bad. So when we start burning coal in the 1830s, that happened only in England. That was not too bad for the environment, although locally it was quite a bad thing because it had a huge impact. But on a global level, it didn't matter that much. But once you start to increase and increase pollution, then the marginal cost of pollution is increasing. And the marginal benefits of pollution, they go down. And as you can see here, this downward sloping curve is called the marginal benefit of pollution curve, the MBP. And at the same time, it's also the marginal abatement cost curve. So how much do we need to pay in order to get rid of 1 unit of pollution? Of what is the cost to society to get rid of a unit of pollution? So, and why is this one downward sloping? Well, for example, driving cars and vehicles is polluting the environment, so it's a bad thing. But the benefit of having at least a few vehicles driving the roads is quite high to society. Think of the ambulances that transport people to the hospital. They carry high benefits, so the benefits of the first units of pollution are rather high. But once we keep expanding our production, then the marginal benefit that the extra pollution allows us to produce is not that great. So just the average plastic toy that you give to children based on oil is quite pollutive, and the marginal benefit to society may be pretty low. So the efficient level of pollution is at the point where the marginal cost of pollution is identical to the marginal benefits of pollution, all from a societal point of view. So if we look at the market for pollution, it's not optimal for society to have zero pollution because we can only reach that level at a very high cost. It's the same that you don't want to live in a society where the number of people that die from traffic accidents is equal to zero, because, well, in principle, you can easily reach that target of zero. You just forbid all cars to drive. People may only drive their bicycle, their non-electric bicycle, that is to say, or they can walk. And if you would impose that, you might be able to reduce the traffic deaths to zero or a number close to zero. But it would come at such a high cost to society that it's not optimal to go for that level. In the same vein, it's not optimal to strive for zero pollution in society. The optimal amount of pollution that you want to allow is the point where the marginal cost of pollution is equal to the marginal benefits of an additional unit of pollution. I already told you, so why the marginal cost of pollution curve slopes upward. Because at low levels of pollution, the damage is relatively low, but it's increasing the more and more we pollute. As the health costs become more severe, the environmental consequences become more severe. So the additional units of pollution are much more costly than the first units of pollution. Why does the marginal benefit of pollution slope downward? Well, the first units of pollution allow you to do things, to produce and consume things that are very beneficial to society. But at the lower end, if you have high levels of pollution, the additional benefits of even polluting more is pretty low. And as pollution falls, so if you move up to the ladder, so when you talk about the abatement cost, if you have a highly polluting society, then, well, reducing some of the pollution is just low-hanging fruit. It's easy to do. You can do so at a very low cost because, well, you don't have to close vital industries to do that. You just scale down a little bit on your travel patterns and so on. But once you have already reduced pollution by a lot, then reducing pollution even more can only come at a very high cost. That is, if you don't have a lot of technological progress. So the first windmills, it's easy to do. You can plant them somewhere where no one worries about them. That allows you to reduce pollution. But if you want to go close to zero emissions, then you also need to erect windmill and windmill farms at places where people like them less. So they have to also be located close to the areas where people live, or if they're not people living there, then there may be nice scenery and nature. So there's also a cost of putting the windmills there. So the cost to society increase the more pollution you want to reduce. So the marginal abatement cost is the cost of reducing emissions by 1 unit. The 1 unit is included here because we talk about the marginal abatement cost. And it includes both the technological cost of reducing pollution, what do we need to do to get rid of it, and also the production that cannot take place anymore because, well, you cannot pollute. So some sectors, industries, products that may not be able to operate anymore. The previous figure is very similar to the supply and demand curve that we have seen throughout this class. So you could interpret this graph as the marginal benefits of pollution is the demand for pollution, and the marginal cost of pollution is the marginal cost to society. So it's the societal supply curve of pollution. And this is a fictive market, so it's not a real market because the marginal cost to society is not something that we observe in the market. So we don't actually observe this supply curve. It's a hypothetical market, but it's instructive to think of it in this way because the resulting optimal price and quantity is something that informs us. But given that the market doesn't exist in real life, so we cannot just leave it to the market and see what will be the outcome, what can we induce? What can we do to induce the private parties to produce and to consume those quantities that are optimal from a societal point of view? Now, first answer to this question is we can use prices to fix the externalities. So we can change the price of goods and services that carry positive or negative externalities. So for negative externalities, we can tax the production or consumption of the good. So we can tax fuel, we can tax cigarettes, we can tax flying to far destinations. So all kinds of taxes on production and consumption are possible to fix negative externalities. If the externality is positive, if the benefits to society go beyond the private benefits, then you can give individuals, firms, or individual consumers a subsidy to stimulate them to produce or consume more of that type of product. When we have negative externalities and we want to impose a tax that reflects the negative externality to third parties, then we call this a Pigouvian tax. So why a special name? Now, a Pigouvian tax is a tax that has the purpose of equating, of being equal to the external marginal cost that is imposed by the externality, and it's aimed at setting the incentives of the private individual equal to the incentives as they should be from a societal point of view. We also have other taxes with other aims, because many taxes don't serve the purpose of correcting for an externality, but they serve the purpose of raising revenues for the government. And those are non-Pigouvian taxes. So Pigouvian taxes are taxes that are designed to fix market failures and to improve social welfare. So let's look at an example, returning to the power plant example. So we had this supply and demand for electricity. We had an equilibrium market price and quantity, and we had an external marginal cost. And now we incorporate a Pigouvian tax, and the tax is equal to the external marginal cost. So the supply curve in this industry is no longer to the upward sloping red line that's depicted over here, because the marginal cost of the company now includes also the tax that it needs to pay. So it knows that for each additional unit of electricity, it needs to pay the marginal cost of production, but also a tax to the government. So it has now internalized the externality such that the supply curve of the firms becomes equal to the orange line over here. And we reach a new market equilibrium where we have an equilibrium quantity Q star, which is lower than the quantity that we had before. And this is something that we want from a societal point of view, because we want to fix the externality. Now, you may already have guessed that if you want to fix a positive externality, then you don't want to impose a Pigouvian tax, but you may want to give a Pigouvian subsidy. And indeed, that is how it works. So a Pigouvian subsidy is a subsidy that is equal to the external marginal benefits that is imposed by the externality. Returning to the education example and the college degrees. So this is our original market and supply function. It's an inefficient outcome because students don't take into account the benefits that they have to society. You should do that more often. It will make you happy. But normally people don't when they take education. So if the market is not regulated, if there's no subsidy, then the number of college degrees will be too small from a societal point of view. Now, what can you do to fix that? Well, you can give a subsidy that is equal to the external marginal benefit. So you make education cheaper. And if you do that, then students, pupils, everyone who wants to take education internalizes this positive benefit to society, because they are aware of being given a subsidy, because that impacts them immediately. So the supply function for education shifts outward from the blue line to the dark green line that we have over here. And in the new equilibrium, supply equals demand, and we reach the equilibrium outcome A, and the equilibrium quantity of college degrees is higher than before. And the price of a college degree also increased, so because it's subsidized, the providers of education, universities, they get more money, but the people who take education, so the students, they pay less than they did in the old equilibrium. And now we return to the leather tanning example that was also the subject of quiz 17.1. So suppose now that the government imposes a tax of $4 on every hide of leather that is sold. So this tax is exactly identical to the external marginal cost, which was also 4. So we have a Pigouvian tax here. The industry short-run supply curve is the same as before, and the inverse demand is also similar to before. And we need to answer the following question. How many leather hides would be sold and what price would buyers pay, what price would sellers receive in case this tax is imposed? Now, we can work on this. We know from chapter 3 that once there is a tax or a subsidy, there is a wedge between the price that buyers pay and the price that sellers receive. In this case, buyers pay $4 more than the sellers receive because 4 is the size of the tax. And the inverse supply and demand curves are given by 3Q and 60 minus 7Q. But the PS and the PB are different things here. So we need to, before we equate the two, we need to be sure that on the left-hand side we have the same thing. And to do so, we rewrite the supply curve, the function above, in terms of PB. Now we know that PB is PS plus 4, so we insert the 3Q for the PS in this equation. That gives us that PB is 3Q plus 4. That's the supply curve relation between the price buyers pay and the quantity. And we solve for the equilibrium quantity by equating 3Q plus 4 to the 60 minus 7Q. Doing so, solving for Q, we get a new equilibrium quantity of 5.6 million leather hides, and the price that is paid by buyers and sellers are 20.8, respectively 16.8. And if you return to the quiz at the beginning of this section, then you observe that indeed the Pigouvian tax of $4 per leather hide that is produced helps to completely fix the externality because the new equilibrium quantity is at the social optimal level. This is one example of prices fixing externalities. Another thing that you can do is to use a quantity mechanism. So if you use a quantity-based intervention instead of a price-based intervention, you want to accomplish the same thing. You want to steer the market towards the efficient outcome. And what you can do is to set a quota, which is a regulation that mandates that the production or the consumption of a certain quantity of a good is limited. So in case of a negative externality, you say, okay, the production and consumption of this good has negative consequences to society, and we limit production to this and this number of units. If the good has a positive externality, you may state that there's a minimum amount of the good that needs to be produced. Again, an example. So we look at electricity, which has a negative externality to society. So we have a positive external marginal cost. This is the optimal amount that we need to produce from a societal point of view. If we leave it to the market, we end up in point B. So how can we fix the externality by a quantity-based regulation? Well, easy thing to do is say the amount of electricity cannot exceed the level Q star. And another way of accomplishing that is you forbid firms to supply more. So you set the marginal cost of the extra production to an infinite level. And that helps you to reach the equilibrium outcome A. Then there are nice applications of that, and also examples that you need to be careful if you interfere in the market by imposing taxes, subsidies, or quantity regulations, that if you overlook some of the incentives, then things go very wrong. So historically, fishing effort in this is a situation I think in Canada, was managed using tools such as total allowable catch limits and limited entry. So overfishing carries a negative externality, because if you catch a fish today, it's not available for people in the future, and the fish will not be able to have any offspring, so the lake will be empty. And to fix this negative externality, the government may impose a quota, saying, okay, there's a total catch that is allowed to make, and the number of vessels that can enter the waters is limited to a certain number. And they were effective in limiting the catch, but they had some negative side consequences, because this was a total allowable catch, so it was set at the aggregate level for the entire industry. So, and they limited the number of vessels, so they give huge incentives to the fishermen to make more use of this limited number of vessels. So if you cannot have more vessels, then you should ensure that with the vessels that you have, you can catch more fish. So there was a heavy investment into better electronics to see where the fish is, larger crews that allow to catch more fish. And also in response to the total allowable catch at the industry level, that induced a race between the fishermen. So at the beginning of each year, they knew this year we can catch this and that many ton of fish. So the fishermen were, at January 1st, they headed out on the sea in order to catch the fish. They were in a race, and that led to the season being reduced from a 60-day season to only a 6-day season. After 6 days, the total allowable catch was reached, because everyone was in a hurry to catch the fish as soon as possible. But that, of course, is very dangerous, because the fishermen, they didn't care about the weather. They also went out in bad weather, because if they didn't do it, another fisherman would, and there would not be any quota left for them. So they disregarded the weather circumstances, and the number of sinking ships and dead fishermen increased. So that was not good. And also because the season was so short and all these fishermen were active only in these 6 days, also the regulators had a hard time to keep track of them and to enforce the total allowable catch. And that also meant that it was exceeded in practice by 10% in 1919. After some thinking, the government decided that they had to implement new regulations, and they incorporated an individual vessel quota system. So the quota was no longer determined at the aggregate level, but at the individual level. So each vessel was given yearly a share of the total allowable catch, and the right to fish at any point in an 8-month season until it was reached. Now, given that you now own your own allowable catch, you don't have to worry about competing fishermen catching your fish, because you still have this right to catch and you can wait for the good weather. And these quotas were also tradable at some point, so that further increased efficiency, because if other fishermen are more efficient in catching the fish, then they can make a better use of your quota. They are also willing to pay for your quota. That leads also to efficient market outcomes. And the enforcement, so the regulators, they were paid by the fishermen because there was a tax imposed of 0.09 Canadian dollars per pound of fish. It brought many benefits because firms now started to focus on lowering their cost instead of racing to the waters to catch the fish. And fishing was made safer because the season lasted longer. And also, the price of the fish increased because in the 6-day season, a lot of fish flooded the market in these 6 days, leading to very low equilibrium prices. In the rest of the year, there was no fresh fish available, for which people are willing to pay a premium. But now, with the fishermen spreading more across a longer season, the supply of fish at any given day was lower, at least of the fresh fish, leading to higher equilibrium prices. So, and it also reduced the uncertainty of the fishermen because they were not that much dependent on the other fishermen and competing for fish. So, and this more stable revenue stream also allowed the fishermen to invest more. But also some problems. So the quota were tied to a vessel. So the primary beneficiaries of the system were the owners of the vessels. So that changed the bargaining position between the owners of the vessels and the crew that did the work on the vessels. So the crew earned less. And because of the focus on cost savings, the employment in the communities also went down, because one way to save costs is to invest in technology, such that you need less fishermen on board. But if you fire the fishermen in these communities where not a lot of other industry and ways of employment are available, that also increases unemployment. And then there is a question whether it is fair to give the right to a public asset, like catching fish in public waters, whether it's fair to give that right to private citizens, being the owners of the vessels for an infinite period. And then there is this predation from lines by sperm whales. This is a story that you can read that was published in the Economist a couple of years ago. So if you're interested in that, it's a funny story, interesting story, please read. So we have now learned about two methods to control for externalities. So mechanisms that are price-based and mechanisms that are quantity-based. A natural question to arise at this point is, which one should we use? Which one is preferred? The answer to this question is that as long as there's no uncertainty, as long as there's perfect information, then the price and quantity mechanism both do the job. They are equally effective in fixing externalities. That being said, you already guess that this changes when perfect information is not available. So if there's uncertainty about the future, about the cost of abatement, for example, then regulators face significant informational problems. And in this field, they often do, because if it comes to the cost of reducing pollution, it's often very much unclear what the cost to a firm will be to reduce, say, CO2 emissions, because it depends on technological progress. If there's a lot of progress and there are innovations, then the cost may turn out to be a lot lower than originally expected. So a couple of years ago, the Dutch government spent high sums of subsidy to have offshore windmill farms being established. And at some point, the cost of erecting these windmill farms fell to such a level that subsidies were no longer needed. So the cost of controlling externalities is hard to know ex ante, and the benefits of controlling externalities are also difficult to assess. So there's a lot of uncertainty involved, and when there's uncertainty in the abatement cost, the price and quantity mechanisms are no longer equivalent. And why is that? Well, there's a simple difference between the two, and here I'm going to really do an open door. A price instrument fixes the price of pollution, so it imposes a tax. The tax is then given, but firms are still flexible in the quantity that they want to produce. However, if you have a quantity instrument, then the quantity is fixed and the firms cannot exceed that quantity independent of the market prices. And that's a fundamental difference between the two. To make this clear, I will give you an example where the marginal cost of abatement turned out to be higher than expected. So, under pollution permit system, where firms get the permission to emit a certain amount of pollution, but no more, firms are forced to abate a fixed amount of pollution. They have to reduce their pollution by a certain amount. If you have a pollution tax system, then firms can abate any amount that they wish, but they know that for every unit of pollution they have to pay the tax. So in that case they will limit pollution not to a given amount, but up till the amount where the additional cost of reducing pollution is higher than the marginal benefit of doing so. In that case they will simply pay the tax. Same story, but then graphically. So suppose that there's fertilizer runoff, which is a bad thing. So this is in terms of particles, and there's a price. So there's a marginal benefit of pollution, which is a downward sloping curve, and this is identical to the marginal abatement cost. So if we're here, the cost of reducing pollution a little bit is pretty low, can be done at a low price, but once you're here, you can only attain further reductions at a high abatement cost. And the marginal cost of pollution curve is given here. Now suppose that the government officials initially believed that the abatement cost is equal to this line over here. So small amounts are not that costly to abate, but going to the lower levels, then it becomes more costly. And the point that is optimal from the social point of view is where the marginal benefits of pollution equal the marginal cost of pollution. So it's the level, the point depicted here by the arrow. Now, how can the government ensure that this point will be reached? Now, it can, for example, impose a tax on pollution. So it imposes a tax equal to the amount capital T for every unit of pollution. And the firms, they know of the tax and that they need to pay it if they pollute, but they continue polluting as long as the marginal benefits of pollution to the firm exceed the cost of the tax. And then once the marginal benefits of additional emissions to the firm become equal to the tax that they have to pay to the government for additional units of emission, they stop. So if there's perfect information about the marginal benefits of pollution, then the government can just impose a tax equal to T, and it will reach the optimal level of fertilizer runoff. However, now it turns out that this abatement cost is uncertain, and in the end, the abatement cost is higher than originally expected. So instead of the blue curve that we had before, the actual cost of abatement is equal to the lighter blue line. Well, given that this is the actual marginal benefit of pollution, and this is the marginal cost of pollution, it turns out that the optimal point of the optimal amount of pollution to society is equal to the level A, where pollution is equal to pole star. But it means that when the government imposes a tax equal to the amount T, and the firms actually face this lighter blue curve, that means that for longer, for more pollution, the benefits of polluting exceed the price of the tax T. So they pollute more than originally envisioned because it's too costly not to pollute, or stated differently, the benefits of pollution exceed the price of the tax. So when the price instrument is used, when the government imposes this tax T, and the abatement costs turn out not to be this level over here, but this level over here, then in equilibrium, the firms will pollute up to the level pole C. So they will pollute more than is socially optimal. Now, if instead, based on the original information, the government had imposed a quotum saying, okay, as an industry, you cannot pollute more than this pole B, then if it turns out that the cost of reducing pollution is higher than expected, and the marginal abatement cost is higher, the firms will not produce more pollution because they cannot, because this quotum is imposed that prohibits them from doing so. So in that case, the amount of pollution that they will attain will be equal to pole B, which then is less than what turns out to be the optimal amount of pollution from a societal point of view. Long story short, if the government imposes a tax and the marginal abatement costs turn out to be higher, then we will have more pollution than is socially optimal. If instead the government had used the quantity mechanism and set a quotum at pole B, then we would have less pollution than is socially optimal. Both create a deadweight loss, and the deadweight loss from the Pigouvian tax is equal to the area capital Y over here. And in this case, the deadweight loss from the quotum, the quantity mandate, is equal to the area X over here. So in the light of uncertainty and how the uncertainty resolves in this particular instance, we can see that the tax, the price mechanism in this particular situation does more harm, and the area Y is bigger than the area X. So it's the quantity mechanism here is preferable to the price mechanism, and they're not identical. In other situations, the price mechanism can be preferable to the quantity mechanism. So here we have another situation. So government officials initially believe that the marginal abatement cost is equal to the blue line over here. So if they impose a tax, they will set it at a level capital T that will ensure that at the point where the marginal benefits of pollution equals the tax rate is exactly equal to the envisioned optimal level, and the quotum will be set at this pollution B fact. Now it turns out that the actual cost again is higher than originally expected. So point A again denotes the real social optimum. So the optimal pollution is pole star. And now we see that with the quotum, again, we will have less pollution than is socially optimal. With the tax, with the price mechanism, we will have more pollution than is socially optimal. But now the deadweight loss from the tax, the area Y, is smaller than the area X. And the reason is that in this case, the marginal abatement cost is steep relative to the marginal cost of pollution. So the cost that firms need to make in order to reduce additional units of pollution increases quite rapidly. And in those cases, the quantity mechanism is the less preferable mechanism, because in this case, if it turns out that its cost is higher than expected, they still need to reduce to the level pol B, because that is the quantity that is set by the government. And in order to do so, the firms need to make very, very high costs, which are not optimal from a societal point of view. So here you can see that depending on the slope of the marginal abatement cost curve, it can go either way. In some cases, the price mechanism is preferred to the quantity mechanism, and sometimes it's just the other way around. And this brings us to the second quiz. So, recreation centers allow young people to play sports when not in lockdown and do other activities at a marginal cost of 0.25 Q. The inverse demand curve for recreation centers is given by the function that is given here. And P is the price of entry, and Q measures hundreds of entrants. And recreation centers, they generate positive externalities because young people are not on the street engaging in worse activities, but doing something that is productive. So the external marginal benefits of these recreation centers are represented by this function EMB, which is equal to 1 plus 0.006 times Q. Now the questions. Without government intervention, how many people will use the recreation centers? Because there's an external marginal benefit, equilibrium quantity will be less than is socially optimal. And so second question is to solve for the social demand curve for recreation centers. And then C, finally, what is the social optimal number of entrants in this industry? And then finally, explain how the government could use a price-based intervention to achieve this socially optimal number of entrants that you have computed in question C. That's enough to work on. Please take your time to solve this question, and then we will continue with the answer in section 17.3. The answer to the quiz question, and I've repeated in the blue box the main things that we need in answering the question. So question A asks you to derive equilibrium demand. So we equate demand and supply. The demand function is given by 10 minus 0.25 Q, and the supply curve is given by the upward sloping part of the marginal cost curve, 0.25 Q. Solving for Q gives you Q equal to 20. In B, you need to solve for the social demand curve. The social demand curve is equal to the demand curve plus the external marginal benefit. So here we have the demand curve, and we aggregate that with the external marginal cost. So 10 plus 1 is 11, minus 0.25 Q plus 0.06 Q is minus 0.19 Q, and that gives us the social demand curve. In C, we need to solve for the social optimal output. So we equate the social demand curve with the supply, and we get 11 minus 0.19 Q is equal to 0.25 Q. Again, solving for Q gives us Q equal to 25, which is higher than the 20 as expected. And finally, we have question D. So there are not enough recreation centers if you leave it to the market because of the positive externality. And to encourage more use, the government should subsidize recreation centers. And then the question is, how much subsidy should the government give per unit of consumption? And this is a bit of the harder question because, as you can see from our external marginal benefits function, it's not a constant. So it's a function of the total quantity that is consumed. So in order to determine the subsidy, we need to plug in the optimal value for Q into our external marginal benefits function. So the optimal amount is 25. Inserting that into the external marginal benefit function gives us that we need to implement a subsidy of $2.50 per unit. So be aware that this is how you need to solve for the optimal subsidy level if the external marginal benefits are not a constant. Plug in the optimal value of Q. And that completes the answer to the quiz question. Then we continue with further topics, section 17.3, starting with the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons is something that we already came across when we studied the application with the fisheries, because fishing ponds are the prime example of a common pool resource. And the problem with common resources is that they are used more intensively than they would be if they are privately owned. And as a result, they will get depleted at some point. No fish left in the lake. And then there's an example of a negative externality. And the problem with the common resource is that there are no barriers to using it. Everyone can freely access the common resource. This is also why it is called a common resource. So, and the value of to the individual consumer decreases with the use by other people. So, again, rivers, lakes, fisheries, public forests, and other sources of water, also the atmosphere, are all examples of common resources. Public airways, public bathrooms. You can imagine that if more people use the public bathrooms, then your individual benefits of using the public bathroom will not increase, and it's likely to decrease because it will be more dirty. And the key characteristic of common resources is non-excludability. So once they are there, you cannot prevent people from using it. And that means that people have really little incentive to protect the resource for others because they don't realize the full cost of overuse. So if you visit the public bathroom, you take into account your private benefits and your private costs, but you don't take into account the contribution that you make to the overuse. And the same holds for fisheries. Because if you look at the other extreme, if the lake would be owned by a single person, so if the Atlantic Ocean would be owned by a single person, what would happen? The individual would incorporate the fact that having fish in the Atlantic Ocean, not only today but also tomorrow, is very valuable. And it's much more valuable than fishing all the fish in the Atlantic Ocean today, and then tomorrow you're still the owner of the ocean, but it's only water and no fish. So once you own the good, you take into account the externality, you internalize the externality. And you will treat the fishery or the ocean like an asset. And in particular, if you will catch a fish today, you will realize that it comes with three costs. So first, the cost of catching the fish, but also with the opportunity cost. So again, here we have the opportunity cost. You will also incorporate the fact that if you catch the fish today, you forgo the opportunity to catch it tomorrow, and you also forgo the opportunity for the fish to generate offspring, so that there may be even more fish to catch tomorrow. And by treating the resource like an asset, it will also earn you a resource rent. So you will get a rent from owning the resource. Just like if you own capital, you will be happy to earn the rent that we then call an interest rate on your capital. And if you own the production factor labor, you are able to earn a wage today, and that will not affect the amount of labor that you can provide tomorrow if you don't work too much. But you take that into account, that if you overwork today, you may have a burnout tomorrow and not be able to work, not be able to earn money anymore. So since you own your own labor capacity as a private individual, you also tend to invest in having a healthy body that enables you to earn income, not only today, but also in the future. And the same holds when you earn own resources. And that's also been a reason. So also home ownership. The idea is that home ownership is good for society because people who own their own house, they are well aware that they have to maintain the house because that will increase the value of the home, also if they want to sell it. But if you rent a home, you may not take that into account and you may really run down the home. So private ownership leads you to internalize the externalities. What if the lake is not owned by anyone? Then individual fishermen, they will only consider their own cost, their own private cost and benefits in deciding how much to fish. And since they cannot capture the benefits of leaving the fish in the lake, you can leave it here in the lake today, but you don't own the fish, so someone else may catch it today, and there will not be any offspring tomorrow, so then it's better to catch the fish yourself today. And by that mechanism, the fisheries without private ownership, they will experience what is called rent dissipation. So any positive economic profit experienced in the fishery will be driven to zero because new entrants will start fishing and dissipate all the positive rents that you could earn. And this happens in practice. So open access, so fisheries that have no barriers to entry, they in important cases have experienced overexploitation, and some historically important fisheries have collapsed. So recently there was a story in The Economist about the Lake Victoria in Africa, where things like this are also happening. So non-excludability is a problem that leads to overexploitation. So how to solve that? Well, make it private. Give private property rights and ensure that there is someone who takes care and takes the future benefits into account in today's decisions. And that brings us close to the Coase theorem, which says that you can fix the externalities on their own by giving people ownership to a good. So the Coase theorem says that as long as costless negotiation among market participants is possible, so it's not a hassle or very costly to transfer property rights, then property rights will lead to efficient market outcome independent of who owns the property rights. So returning to the example of a fishery, the market will reach the efficient outcome by giving anyone the right, the property right of the fishery. And maybe you've given it to a person who is not very effective in catching fish, but if it's costless to negotiate, then that owner will sell the property rights to the person who can make best use of it. And we will get to an example. So it doesn't matter who has the property right. If individuals can be monitored or if outcomes can be monitored and individuals can constantly coordinate and negotiate, then parties should be able to reach the efficient outcome. That said, this is an if statement. So it's conditional on costless coordination and monitoring of outcomes, and that not always holds in practice. So coordination in practice may be very difficult, especially when there are information problems, that some parties engaged in a transaction have better information, say, about how much fish there is in the lake, and also when many participants are involved. So if you need to coordinate with many people, it's always more difficult than if you have to coordinate with 2 people. So let's do an example, and let me introduce the Green Acres Fertilizer Company, which is located near to Barney's dry cleaning service. And the production process of Green Acres emits noxious odors that are absorbed by the clothing that Barney is cleaning, with the result that Barney lost many customers. And Barney estimates that the odors cost his business $10,000 a year. And again, there should not be any information asymmetry. So here, the €10,000 a year is not a matter of debate. It's just given that this is the cost. So there's no uncertainty here and no haggling about the exact business cost to Barney. That said, Green Acres can eliminate the odors by altering the production process, but that will come at a cost of $12,000 a year. So now the question is, what is the social efficient thing? Should Green Acres be allowed to pollute, or should it not be allowed to pollute? So we answer the following questions. Now suppose that you give Green Acres the property right, the right to emit odors. What will be the socially optimal outcome, and how will it be reached, and will any money change hands? And then second, and this is the contrast, now suppose that instead of Green Acres you would give the right to Barney, and that is then the right to have odor-free air. In that case, what will be the socially optimal outcome? How will it be reached, and will money change hands? Now let's answer the question. So the social optimal outcome is when Green Acres is allowed to emit the odor, because the cost of eliminating the pollution is higher than the benefits to Barney. So if no bad odors are emitted, then that will imply that Green Acres has to make a cost of $12,000, while Barney only gains a benefit of the odor-free air of $10,000. So that is a negative sum and not social optimal. So the benefits to Green Acres exceed the cost to Barney. So the social optimal outcome is that Green Acres will emit. Now, when Green Acres has the right to do so, then nothing will happen, and it will continue to emit the odors because it has the right. Barney is willing to pay $10,000 to Green Acres in order to stop emitting, but the $10,000 is less than the $12,000 of cost that Green Acres needs to make in order to make that happen. So it will decline and continue emitting, and no money will change hands. Now suppose that Barney has the right to odor-free air. Then the social optimal outcome is determined by the relative values that Green Acres and Barney place on the resource, in this case the air. But just like before, Green Acres values the right to emit more than Barney values the right to have clean air. So Green Acres is willing to bid Barney up to €12,000 in order to be allowed to emit. 12,000 is more than the cost to Barney when the bad odors are emitted, which are 10,000. So Barney will be happy to sell its right on odor-free air to Green Acres at a sum somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000. So in this case, money will change hands from Green Acres to Barney, and it will be a sum somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000. And importantly, you see that the final outcome is the same in both situations. Both situations will end up with a situation where we have polluted air, independent on who was initially given the property right. Of course, in the second case, Barney is better off because at least he gets some money, where he doesn't get that money in the first place. So, although the market outcome is the same, independent of the property rights, it matters to Green Acres and Barney who is initially given the property rights, because one choice makes them better off than the other. And the Coase theorem has been very influential and has helped to design all kind of government regulations to control externalities. And it's also one of the reasons that we have now this tradable permit scheme for CO2 emissions that are tradable on the market. And the polluting industries, they are given initial rights to pollute to a certain extent, but they can sell these rights on the market, and that leads to an efficient outcome. Open question still is whether you can consider it fair that the most polluting firms get the most rights initially and make a profit from selling them. So if you ask the question, should the regulatory agency, how should it distribute the rights to pollute? Answer is, it doesn't matter. Market outcome will be the same. Should they be given away for free, allocated by sector, auction to the highest bidder? According to the Coase theorem, it doesn't matter at all. The final outcome will be the same in all cases. And markets have an important role to ease coordination. So if there is a firm that can make a better use of permits to emit CO2, then it will be happily to buy that rights on the market from a firm that can not make that good use of these permits, and that other firm will be happy to sell them at that price. Then finally, we consider another type of goods that have problems to come into being when we leave it to the market. And these goods are public goods. So public goods also face the problem that if we leave it to the market, often not a socially optimal amount is provided. So a public good is a good that benefits the individual even as others consume it. So you can consume it, but it doesn't decrease the marginal benefits to others of consuming it as well. And examples are clean air. If we live in a society with clean air, I can inhale clean air, but if I inhale clean air, it doesn't reduce the amount of clean air that you can inhale. So it doesn't reduce your benefits. Also with fireworks, if I look at the fireworks, your utility from looking at the fireworks as well doesn't go down. So that are public goods. National defense is also an example, and they are very similar to goods with positive externalities. They provide positive external benefits to everyone, regardless of who purchases them. So if I at New Year's Eve buy very nice fireworks just for my own pleasure, and then the entire neighborhood benefits from looking at it, at least if they like fireworks. So I privately purchase them, but they also bring a positive benefit to the people around me who were not involved in the transaction of buying the fireworks. But public goods are different because they're non-rival. So that's really the key thing, that your utility from consuming the good does not change when more other people consume the good as well. Now, and that completes our classification of different types of goods. So based on excludability and rivalry, we can construct a table. And the table is also given in the book, and it looks as follows. So if you have goods that are rival, my consumption prevents the consumption of the same good by other people, and they're excludable, people can be kept from consuming, then we talk of private goods. So tacos, paper, gasoline, I buy it. If I buy it, I block the consumption by others, and if I buy it, no one else can benefit from that taco, say, because I will eat it. Then the common resources are also rival, so there's rivalry for consuming the good, but it's non-excludable, so you cannot deny other people from access to the good. Then are the public goods that are non-excludable and non-rival, so fireworks is one. And then there's the fourth category of goods that we didn't discuss extensively, which are the club goods. So if you enter a club or the sporting center, the fitness club, then you may have to buy a subscription. So it's excludable. Not everyone can go there for free once the fitness center is there. But it's non-rival in the sense that if you are in the club and in the disco, it doesn't reduce the utility to other people. So satellite television, watching the Formula 1 on television, you may have to pay a fee in order to get access, but then you can just watch the racing and your utility is not diminished by many other people watching the race at the same time. Then, question is, what is the optimal level of public goods? Now, the market efficiency requires that a good is produced until the social marginal benefits are equal to the marginal cost of production. So, since public goods are non-rival, the marginal benefit of a given level of provision is the vertical sum of all individuals' marginal benefits curves. So, total marginal benefit is defined as the sum of the individual marginal benefits. And then the subscript I indicates each individual. Now, in the cost side is the same as with any non-public good, so nothing new there. And graphically, it will look as follows. So we have the quantity of the public good, then we will draw the marginal benefit function and the marginal cost function. The marginal cost function is just like before, but we have two individuals, and the marginal benefit of consuming the public good for individual 1 is given by this yellow curve, and for individual 2 it's given by this curve over here. If we leave it to the individuals themselves, then they will consume the amount of the public good such that the marginal cost is equal to the marginal benefits. So individual 1 will be here, and individual 2 will privately buy this number of units of the public good. However, that is less than what is optimal from a societal point of view, because it's non-rivalry. So the total marginal benefit is equal to the sum of the two individual benefits. So, and it's vertical summation here, because if we provide public goods up to the level Q public star, then this amount of provision of the public good has a marginal benefit. If we would add an incremental unit, it would have a marginal benefit to individual 1 of this level. At the same time, it would carry an incremental benefit to individual 2 equal to the level over here. So the total marginal benefit of increasing the provision of the public good with an incremental unit would be equal to the level A over here. And this is all driven by non-rivalry, because you can simply aggregate the marginal benefit of all individuals in society. So the social optimal point is point A, and that exceeds the level of or the quantities that individual 1 and 2 would buy privately. So we can see that if we leave it to the market, we get an under provision of the public good compared to the social optimal outcome. So why do we have this under provision? So the first reason we saw on the previous slide. So if you just look at it from a private perspective, you will buy the public good up to the point where the private cost of buying additional units is equal to the private benefits. Whereas if you look from the collective, the public benefits are larger than the private benefits. So the efficient level occurs where the total marginal benefits equal the marginal cost. And the second problem is due to the non-excludability of public goods, they may induce free riding. If I know that my neighbor always has very nice fireworks, I may be tempted to free ride on that and never buy any fireworks, because I can for free watch his fireworks. So and that's really another source of inefficiency. So why should you take on any private cost when you can simply benefit from the provision without paying anything? Okay, so practical example. We have Dale and Casey, who are neighbors in a rural area, and they are considering the joint installation of a large fountain near the joint property line, so they can each enjoy its beauty, just like fireworks, and also improve the value of the property. And Dale's marginal benefit from the fountain is given by marginal benefit is 70 minus Q, and Q in this case is the diameter of the fountain. And Casey's marginal benefit from the fountain is 40 minus 2Q. And now assume that the cost of producing the fountain is constant and equal to 80 per foot in terms of diameter. And then the question, no surprise, find an equation to represent the total marginal benefit of the fountain. And what is the social optimal size of the fountain? And would you expect Dale and Casey to build the optimally sized fountain if they don't coordinate? So, question 1. The total marginal benefit is the sum of the individual marginal benefits. So we just sum the two marginal benefit functions that are given, and we arrive at 110 minus 3Q. The social optimal size of the fountain is at the point where the marginal benefits to the society equal the marginal cost of producing the fountain. So we equate the 110 minus 3Q to 80, because the marginal cost is constant at 80 per feet. So we increase the diameter until the point where the additional cost of adding another feet is, or another foot, is equal to 80. And that point is reached where the fountain has reached a diameter of 10 feet. So this is the social optimal diameter for the fountain. But when Dale and Casey would do it on their own, they would never build a fountain that large. Because, for example, Dale, his private marginal benefit is less than the marginal cost when the diameter is 10 feet. So for Dale, we have that at a diameter of 10, the marginal benefit to Dale is only 60, 17 minus 10, whereas the marginal cost, if he would pay it himself, would be 80. So he would never do that. And the same holds for Casey. So the 10 feet fountain would not come into existence if Dale and Casey had to do it on their own, because it has this public good property. Some of the benefits accrue to other people. Okay, so how can we solve free riding? And the most common way to deal with that is through government action. So governments have the ability to tax citizens, and they use that often to provide collectively what people cannot provide privately. So defense is something that the social benefits by far exceed the private benefits of national defense. So this is something that you want to provide at the societal level. And the same holds for air traffic control, weather forecasting service, and many other things. Also vaccination. There are other solutions. So also groups of private citizens, they can get together and to coordinate to provide certain public goods. So this is what homeowners do if they have these apartment buildings. They take care that the property is maintained. And also it's not true that people will always act as a free rider. So sometimes people also feel a private incentive to contribute to the public good and even derive some utility from doing so. So people sometimes really like doing something for the common good, and we should not rule that completely out. And that brings us to the final quiz of today. And the quiz is quite straightforward. We have 3 consumers of a public good, and they have the following marginal benefit of consumption. And you see 3 functions, and you need to answer the questions. If the marginal cost of producing the public good is equal to marginal cost is A times Q, what is the efficient quantity, the socially efficient quantity, and what is if the marginal cost of producing the public good is constant at 4, what is the efficient quantity of it? So those are the 2 questions with a difference in the marginal cost function. And then I will give you the answer. So we sum the marginal benefits to get the total marginal benefit functions, which then is simply equal to 12 minus 4q. We set it equal to the marginal cost in order to reach the socially optimal provision of the public good, which is equal to 1 unit. And in B, where the marginal cost is different, so instead of having marginal cost is equal to A times Q, now it's a constant equal to 4. Again, we solve for Q, and now we get a higher level of provision of the public good that is socially optimal, Q equal to 2. And that completes the quiz question. So to conclude the chapter, we looked at externalities quite extensively here, and externalities may cause markets for certain goods not to exist. And one particular example is the market for public goods. They may not exist without government intervention. In other markets, like common resources, that if there's no intervention by the government and no private ownership, may lead to over-exploitation, which is also not a good thing. And yeah, that's more or less the entirety of chapter 17. In particular, take care when you study to look at the marginal abatement cost and the deadweight loss that occurs by imposing a certain tax and quantity, especially when there's uncertainty in the marginal abatement cost. I think that is the most difficult part of this chapter, at least conceptually.